Sorry, there is a slight change. As a journalist in me, I'm also looking for new opportunities to make it a news. Finding Montek, Ahluwalia, and Mr. Thiagarajan together is a dream for a journalist because both of them are economists. Both of them been in America and for studies. And he has handled finance for almost 10 years during Manmohan Singh government and in Delhi during M.K. Stalin. Both think alike in terms of economics. I don't in terms of politics they do together, I don't know. His politics and his politics may be different. So I decided, okay, may I request both of them to make economics simple for us, finance simple for us, because he has run the government for 10 years as Planning Commission Deputy Chairman. And I know him for, his wife was my classmate. She was the topper of the batch in 1967 in Delhi School of Economics, and I was on the bottom of the batch. And so we know each other very well since then. Thiagarajan is the finance minister. It's an interesting thing because I'm looking at his dress again. As a journalist again, I look at minute detail. I've been covering DMK politics from, I think, 77, 78. And Mr. Karunanidhi was I was talking to him. He used to write about me in the magazine. Whenever I used to write in India Today, he would criticize me, then meet me all the time. So I know the generation here, and first time I met a cabinet minister who has come in a trouser here in this session, because normally they come in lungis and whatnot and speak the local language. That reflects that there is some kind of a dress doesn't matter, the mind matters. That is how you dress, that is a different thing. I don't want to introduce him because he's a second time MLA, and he has been to America. He has been a banker. He was leading the finance team in Lehman Brothers. So he knows finance better than anybody else in this government, I think. Therefore, he has been chosen by Mr. Stalin to lead the finance department. And he was in the finance department, but he was everything there because Planning Commission during Manmohan Singh time, Montek was the mind. Manmohan Singh ji, of course, he was my teacher, so he was one of the reformists India ever had. And we used to call at that time the Singh Darbar of Narasimha Rao government. There were Dr. Manmohan Singh as finance minister, Montek Singh, Ahluwalia there, and one Mr. N.K. Singh, who was the revenue secretary at that time. After he became revenue secretary later on, they used to run the economic ministry at that point in time. So we are discussing the subject here, but I would change the subject between both of them. First, I must congratulate him for advising the Chief Minister to constitute the Economic Advisory Council, in which you have got people from all over the country and even globally. I think that will lead to some kind of a mutual consultation with stakeholders, which Tamil Nadu connecting with the rest of the country in terms of economics at least. Economic Council is one of the indications. You may not connect politically, but economically you have become part of the global system there. So I must congratulate you for that, for having the council. But there are other issues also in which the economics of Tamil Nadu seems to be little out of the national system. I won't call negative. I would say it is out of the, not in sync with the national system. For example, subsidies on agriculture, on electricity, you are having 12,000 crore rupees of extra expenditure they are having. So investment in this city, is in this state, basically, is not in communicate with other indicators which you have got. You are on the best state in many parameters. But I will leave it to Montek to set the tone for how to integrate Tamil Nadu economics with the national economics, where you find both of them disintegrating each other. Yeah.
I don't think it's a question of integrating. Actually, Tamil Nadu economics should lead the national economics. You know, when I was in the Planning Commission, I always felt that the most difficult task, and I don't think I did a good job of it, is how do you deal with states which are with the range of variation that we have. And Tamil Nadu is at one end, much the most industrialized state, much the most urbanized state, much the most globally connected, and also historically. I mean, the Chawlas were doing a lot of globalization in East Asia at a time when most of North India was all tucked away in the Indo-Gangetic belt. So frankly, I think, and on the other hand, you have states which have 1/5 the per capita GDP of Tamil Nadu. I mean, there are other states that are closer to Tamil Nadu. So actually, when you say, I think that the more industrialized states in India will actually give the lead for the country as a whole. And secondly, once the role of government becomes one of providing infrastructure and facilitating progress, 80% of what a business has to do with the states. So actually we need a much bigger focus on what are the experimental things that states are doing, who's doing better, and Tamil Nadu can be in a position where it can become an exemplar. The rest of the country will naturally follow. Because the people of India live in the states. Somebody once, a mathematician, said the center is a dimensionless point. Nobody actually lives in the center. So in that sense, I personally think that if India is going to do well, it is because states, the more advanced states, will give an example. Now, mind you, with migration, it's not as if the prosperity will not spread. People will move to where the jobs are created. And the demography is such that Tamil Nadu is already getting into the declining population growth phase. All the so-called demographic dividend is up in the north, but unfortunately the educational services that we are providing them is certainly not good enough to merge with the needs of labor. How do we handle that? What do you do about skilling and education? These are dominantly state subjects. They're not central subjects. Central universities account for a very small percentage of the total number of students. It's the state universities. And of course, school education is all with the states.
Well, first, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this unexpected pleasure. Dr. Ahluwalia is a legend, so first time I'm meeting him. Thank you for giving me the chance to be on the same stage. I think a good place to start might be with the Mr. N.K. Singh that you referenced when he came as chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. And I, at the time, was an opposition MLA and I represented my party. And I asked a question. I said, you say that your goals are transparency, equity, and efficiency. Transparency is pretty obvious, there's no... But equity and efficiency can be defined many different ways. And let me just, to tip off the point that you started, successive finance commissions for the last 5 or 6 times have kept on reducing the allocation, the devolution to states like Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu in particular, but states like Tamil Nadu. So I made the point, I said, in a federal setup, in a system, we assume infinite movement of labor, goods, etc., or relatively frictionless movement of all of this. And so if you have a transfer mechanism like the Finance Commission where you take money from a relatively well-to-do state and you give it, at least on a per capita basis, to a much less well-to-do state, that's how the system is supposed to work, no problem. But if I look everywhere around the world in such systems, such transfers reduce inequality and close the gap. So if I look at China, where the coastal provinces are substantially economically more active than the hinterland, transfers happen and the gap narrows. If I look at the European Union, where the Western European countries were substantially better off than Portugal or Italy or Greece, and the transfers happened and the gap narrowed. If I look at the United States, where the New York, California, the coastal states are significantly better off than the interior states, transfers happen and the gap narrows. But here we have 25 or 30 years of finance commissions. You've kept on transferring wealth from the better states to the poorer states. Not only has the gap not narrowed, not only has it stayed stable, but the gap has widened, and the gap has widened in an accelerated manner. The gap is getting worse and worse. So if the definition of efficiency is that you put the money to work in a way that improves people's lives, especially at the weaker end of the spectrum, then this whole process has been a failure, utter failure. So the question arises, what is being done right in some of these states where they keep on climbing, and what is being done wrong in these states where, despite net transfers, they are not able to climb? And so I said, many of these variables that you use to do the allocation, the gap and the population and the green cover and this and that, those are not means to an end. If the end is economic development, then you're not using interim measures that really make a difference. I would suggest the extent to which women are empowered, the percentage of girls that are in school, the extent of equality in employment opportunity, all these drive down fertility rates, they drive up social kind of inclusion, they drive up growth, they drive up harmonious societies. You are not incentivizing those kinds of outcomes because you don't give any money based on that. So you need to fundamentally rethink. So I agree that the states are getting more and more disparate. They were designed disparate to start with because you divided them on language. But the economic and the outcome in every way, in demographic, in social development index, and human development index, have kept on diverging aggressively. So there's some other construct beyond money that is driving this change. And I would say it is the nature of society. Those places where you focus on education, on inclusion, on compassion, on empowerment of women, those places you get good outcomes. And those places those are not the priorities, no matter how much net transfers you do of money, you're not getting the right outcomes. At least that's the theory that I proposed to Mr. Singh. I didn't get a chance to speak to him much when he was here as chairman. I've spoken to him quite a bit since then, after I became minister. And I haven't had any evidence to change my view that these are the fundamental differences.
I think you raised a very fundamental issue in the beginning. I wanted to bring in something else because Montek was there. You raised the allocation of funds also, per capita basis, should distribute or not. Because now GST has come into force where you're getting automatic transfer of money in whatever form. Whether GST, according to me, I'm a student of economics, it becomes something where the states are not encouraged to raise their internal resources because they know some money is coming automatically from the central government. Instead of it is serving the interest of the businessmen, but yeah, compensate. But you are asked for 5 years extension anyway. State many governments. So I'm saying GST is some kind of a discouragement for revenue internal revenues because all of states are involved in what I call the economic term freebies that you distribute so much of money. Issue arises here that since we are in Tamil Nadu, politically you may not be connected to the center, but though you have been part of various governments, but the government fell not because of any economic disparities or disagreement, they fell on political issues. But is there a formula? You raised the question of inequalities rising. From 91, he is one of the masters of economic reforms. It was meant to encourage the wealth of the country. Wealth has definitely increased manifold. If wealth creation or valuation of the market was any concern, it has done its job very successfully. But what is destroyed is that you have pointed out, inequalities of income. Even during the last 5 years, if you look at the figures, top 3% have got about 67% of the wealth creation, new. So what is fundamentally wrong in the system? Ahluwalia Sahab, you started the system. Did you anticipate that what you started, it is some kind of a genie, which is creating social disparities, economic disparities, and people are depending more and more in giving freebies, 6,000 rupees to the farmer, free this, free that, free that. So you are led to a situation where productivity or actual growth is not a criteria. Economic growth is only meant for the economic stock markets. Richer are becoming rich and poorer are becoming poorer.
Well, no, I think, Prabhu, as usual, I think you picked on one of the most important issues that is being discussed around the world. So I'll make a few disconnected remarks. First, the intensity of feeling about inequality is particularly high in the wake of the pandemic, because there's no doubt whatsoever that the pandemic hit us badly. It's a separate issue whether we could have managed it better or not, but all countries were hit, we were also hit. And all countries have found that the poor were hit much more. And as a result, inequality has increased. But you know, to the extent to which this is the result of a short-term hit, the recovery will take care of a lot of it. So my first request to the political leadership and others also, don't invent political solutions for the medium term based on a short-term problem. The most important short-term thing is to get the economy back on track, get the jobs back, and look after the small-scale sector, which has been very, very badly hit. Even give them a little bit more of a benefit, perhaps, than is actually deserved. Once the economy is back to normal, then we'll think about these longer-term issues. Now, on the longer term, you know, very often when you open up opportunities, the people who initially benefit are the ones who are a little bit better positioned. I remember, in fact, it was in 1990 or something, I had come to Chennai and I had written a paper on does economic reform increase inequality among states. And somebody asked me a question from the audience that, you know, of course economic reform will be good for Tamil Nadu, but won't it hurt the backward states? And I was about to give a balanced answer when Mr. Murusali Maran, who was present, he got up and he said, there are no backward states in India, there are only mismanaged states. So this is the real issue that, are you saying because I'm backward, I need some help? I think nobody would dispute that. But the implications of what Finance Minister said earlier, that you cannot continually cover this if you're mismanaging the resources you've got. And that question also needs to be addressed. Frankly, there's no easy way of solving that problem. But you know, the most important thing is that in a federal system, it's logical for a state to constantly say to the central government, you're not being fair to the states. And by the way, I mean, you know, it's a zero-sum game. I mean, whatever the central government does for the states, it takes money away from it. But that's fair enough. I think the important question is that within states, many states, both at the richer end and at the lower end, have a lot of things that they can do. Now, for example, if I were thinking of an incentivization scheme, like the most important thing would be property tax reform. Now, you know, India's property tax as a percent of GDP or something is about 1/10 of what it should be. I mean, that's the order of magnitude. Now, everybody believes we are going to become urban. Everybody says we must have urban services, but nobody's prepared to pay property tax. You can exempt homes of less than 100 square foot, 200 square foot, but let's have a decent property tax system. Now, if a state were to truly modernize its property tax system, that would be terrific. The second very important thing is what you can do for the electricity distribution and the losses generated there. It's a politically an explosive situation. And when I was in the Planning Commission, I used to keep telling my own home state, which has maybe the worst record on this, that these policies that you're following are not environmentally good. And you know, privately the Chief Minister would say, look, I agree with you, but this is politically impossible. Now, I don't think the center can do it, but somewhere something has to be done. The third and the final thing is education. You know, quality of education, what we are seeing in India, I think is this famous ASER result, that 50% of the kids in grade 5 cannot read what a grade 2 kid should be able to read. And states vary, some states do better than others, but this is bad across the board. I think, by the way, we should look at how states are improving, each state, and define a metric so that we can tell, yes, this state has really made progress. And this is all in the realm of the state governments, it's not in the realm of the center.
Thank you. I want to bring back focus to the education. That is what I ask him, because what is happening, you look at the budget allocation to education, all of the states, from center to the states. I don't know whether states are copying the center or center is copying the states. I don't know it. But the budget remains below 2%, 3% in all the states. And quality of education, of course, is bad. But quality of higher education is improving in India, but is becoming costlier and costlier. So do I conclude that we are heading for an elitist education system where we are willing to spend 500 crore rupees for a IIT, but not 500 crore rupees extra for 500 schools. Is that good financing?
No, I think clearly that's not, right? And I think it was this very event last year where I was on a panel where we had this discussion. And I said, if these institutions are funded by private money, the market will regulate it. But if they're funded by state money, then of course we have to ask the question, what is the price we pay for a niche kind of excellence group at the cost of others maybe? But I want to go back to a couple of the points you raised earlier. First, I must give a disclaimer. I'm an engineer, operations research, psychology, finance. I'm not an economist, so nobody should get the wrong idea. Second, I think all growth inherently tends to increase inequality, whether that's because of globalization, whether that's because of innovation, whether that's because of integration like internet integration, even whether it is an exacerbation, as Dr. Alwale said, through a crisis. Almost every event inherently tends to disrupt what we would like to think the role of democracy is. You know, in the Karl Marx view of the world, capitalism would collapse on itself because the returns to capital would keep on increasing and the returns to labor would keep on decreasing. And at some point, the workers of the world would just unite, rebel, there'd be blood on the streets revolution, and then common property would be the only way forward. I mean, very simply put. The antidote to that was democracy, that we were going to have one man, one vote, rather than rich man has greater control, etc. And then you had to stand for election every so often, and therefore you had to keep the masses appeased, and you had to keep them integrated, and you had to keep them still with hope in the system. So that's what democracy is supposed to do. Unfortunately, the failings of democracy are becoming more and more evident, just like the failings of the market are becoming more and more evident, just like monopolists and cartels and oligopolists can corner the markets. Once you have enough money and enough kind of access, you can actually control democracy, it seems, in many parts of the world. So that leads to this problem of increasing inequality. But definitely, at least statistically, it's very clear that after the reforms, the relative performance of states, the gap started accelerating because there is greater activity to partake in. The reforms opened up the system. They created opportunity. Clearly, those that were capable of seizing the opportunity, like Tamilnadu, which had a very strong education base going back to the 1920s, compulsory education in the Justice Party government of 1920s, plus coastline, plus access, plus language, the Anna policy of two language, so almost everybody was somewhat literate in English, and therefore that was global value. So the reforms certainly helped accelerate. But I go back to the point, I think it's not about backward states. I agree completely with my former leader, the late Mr. Maran, that it's about mismanaged states. Everybody has human potential equally. It's the kind of values that the government focuses on, the philosophy, the approach, and whether it is an inclusive and universal approach, and that really makes the difference. And I think that is the, and it starts with education, going back to what you said. It starts with the quality of education. I'll also mention in passing this notion that freebies are the answer to every problem or that they are the root of every problem. Both are misguided. For example, Tamil Nadu has one of the highest per capita incomes, has one of the highest gross enrollment ratios in education, also has one of the highest subsidies. I won't call them freebies because it's a meaningless term, but something given at low cost or no cost. We give maternity kits to all women. We give free cycles to girls going to school. We give laptops to students going to college. We give free uniforms. These are things that we give free food. We have been doing it since 1920. These are investments in our future. We don't consider them as just random freebies, right? So it's not the terminology or the cost of it that makes the difference. It is the attitude, the philosophy, the political underpinnings that drive policy and planning. That's what makes the difference, I think.
Everybody is worried because Tamil Nadu, we are there. Reforms, everybody talking about. And Tamil Nadu has been, in the beginning, historically, it's been one of the most educated in terms of development and whatnot. But I find in terms of ease of doing business, somehow it seems that you are lagging behind. In the sense there are about 26,000 rules and regulations which are criminal laws. I'm told Tamil Nadu tops in there where the businessman can be sent to jail on 1,000 counts. There are processes there, 1,000 laws that they have to be, they can be arrested, sent to jail, and you are much higher in that. Why that is? Because reforms is not happening. Why those legislations are not being dropped and restudied and whatnot?
Yeah, listen, I have not done a comparative study. I've only ever lived briefly in Bombay, Mumbai, and the rest of my time in India, in Tamil Nadu. So I don't know what the relative ease is in different states. On an absolute basis, we are very clear that there's a lot of red tape, unnecessary red tape, a lot of greater ease of doing business required. I'm not so concerned about the laws about people going to jail and all that, because I can't think of any instances. If you have many cases of actual businessmen being jailed, you tell me. But the law, just because the law is on the books doesn't mean it gets actually applied. That's a different story. But we are 100% clear. We have to make it a lot easier for people to do business. Not just the global corporates and the big companies, but for the MSMEs. So we have a task force that has been set up just for that after we came to power.
You are making it a 1 trillion economy as the chief response.
Yeah,
you can't have a criminal law then 1 trillion economy.
I completely agree. So again, it's not just because we're going to 1 trillion. We have a philosophy that the government should not be onerous, should not be red tapeist, that it should be easy to do business, and we are on that path. Maybe the need to get to 1 trillion in 10 years and therefore achieve, 14.5%, 15% nominal growth a year gives us greater impetus to clean it up more quickly and more thoroughly. But philosophically, we are very much inclined to removing a lot of these archaic constraints and freeing up the market. Yeah.
Since time is running, I'll ask the last question. What is your expectation from the central government? Because there's always a problem. I want this money, that money. What do you think? Give one model which is acceptable.
Yeah, listen, I actually go back to Dr. Ahluwalia's point. I think at least the large, rich states, there are a lot of things we can do ourselves. I became finance minister in May. I didn't go to Delhi for the first time till December 30th. I had no need to go and ask for anything. There were a lot of things in my control that I could do, and I'm comfortable. And in 10 days when we present the budget, you'll see that we have outperformed by any stretch of imagination, by any measure. We have phenomenally outperformed not just the last 10 years of Tamil Nadu, but certainly most states in India. I did that without needing to go to Delhi. So there's not as if we are all expecting Delhi to be our savior or anything like that, right? But what we expect from Delhi is fairness, predictability, and a good partnership that allows for independent decision making. This notion that you can control everything from one place. We have just gone for 20 minutes talking about how diverse states are, how different the conditions are. Why do you presume that you can come up with one homogenized program sitting in Delhi and implement it across 1.4 billion people of such great diversity? It makes no sense. So just allow us. I don't want to go too far, but let's say I went back to Delhi about 10 days ago. I had some meetings with the Finance Secretary, Finance Minister, very courteous, very nice people. But I brought up a technical point which I have not talked about publicly, but I'll say it now. So they tell us that there's a thing called a borrowing limit, right? And it's based on the FRBM Act and our respective acts and all that. Let's just take for now, it's 4.5%. Question is 4.5% of what? So when we set our first budgets, we take 4.5% of the CSO's estimate of what our GSDP is going to be, and we set that as the borrowing limit. Then midway through the year, we get a revised estimate. Like now, we are 11 months into a 12-month year or 11 plus months. So the CSO has updated that number. So when I present the revised estimate in 10 days, I'm going to take 4.5% of that GSDP. But if you look at the actual amount the union allows me to borrow, that number is about 6,000 or 8,000 crores, less than 4.5% of what the CSO says my GSDP is going to be. So then I ask the question, why do you artificially come up with a different number? You know what the answer is? That when you add up the states' GSDPs, they are greater than the national GSDP by about 5%. And therefore, to set the total borrowing of all states into some number that the rating agencies will like, they cut our borrowing limits down. This is crazy. That means that if Tamil Nadu is investing 7 or 6 or 8,000 crores less, all the states together, we're investing 50,000 crores less in capital investment this year because of this artificial construct. How many more jobs we could have created, how much more growth we could have achieved, and this has been going on for many years, right? So why do you put these artificial constraints on us? We are not like school children to be tutored by you how to run our lives, right? We are showing that we can do better than the Indian average in almost any statistic. Let us run our lives, we'll show you good results. If anything, let others emulate what we can teach them, and we'll learn from others who do better than us, right? There doesn't have to be one kind of universal hand, right, on this.
Thank you much. I wish all the finance ministers of the states had the same clarity which you have. And Montague would have given some answer about certain things which are related to the center. Thank you very much for coming here, because we have Mr. Narendran and Srilata out there waiting on the other side. Thank you very much. Thank you, Montague, for joining us.